Picture this. It's 1941, and America needs to build a cargo ship that weighs 14,000 tons, stretches longer than 1.5 football fields, and can carry 2,500 tons of military supplies across an ocean filled with German submarines that are literally hunting these things for sport. Now here's the kicker. The absolute best shipyards in the entire world, places that had been building ships for over a century, took 230 days to construct just one of these massive vessels. That's almost 8 months of round-the-clock work, by master craftsmen who'd spent their entire lives perfecting their trade. But then this guy walks into a room full of Navy admirals and shipbuilders and tells them, without a shred of doubt in his voice, that he can do it in a fraction of that time. And get this, he'd never built a single ship in his entire life. Not one. He knew absolutely nothing about maritime construction, naval engineering, or traditional shipbuilding. The experts looked at him like he'd just claimed he could fly to the moon by flapping his arms really hard. They laughed at him. They called him a fool, a con artist, a dangerous amateur who was going to waste precious wartime resources and get people killed. One naval engineer literally told him to go back to whatever backwater construction site he crawled out of and leave shipbuilding to the professionals. But here's where this story gets absolutely wild. Within 2 years, this man built a complete Liberty ship, from the first piece of steel to the moment it hit the water, in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Not months, days. And that record? It still stands today, over 80 years later, as one of the most mind-blowing feats of manufacturing and human coordination ever achieved. Now, before I go any further, I need you to do something for me right now. If you want to see more stories about people who looked at impossible odds and just said, "Watch me," hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Seriously, do it right now, because we dig deep into these kinds of stories on this channel, and YouTube's algorithm only shows these videos to people who actually engage. So smash that subscribe button, and let's get back to how one man broke every rule in the book and literally saved the world while doing it. The man's name was Henry John Kaiser, and in 1940, he was 58 years old, an age when most men are thinking about retirement, not revolutionizing entire industries. Kaiser had made his fortune building some of the most impressive construction projects America had ever seen. We're talking about massive concrete dams that held back entire rivers, highways that cut through mountain ranges, and bridges that seemed to defy gravity. He was a construction titan, a master of moving earth and pouring concrete. But ships, naval architecture, the subtle art of making steel float across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, he didn't know a damn thing about any of that. And that ignorance, that complete lack of traditional training, was about to become his greatest weapon. See, sometimes the biggest breakthroughs don't come from the experts who know all the rules. They come from the outsiders who don't even know the rules exist, who look at a problem with fresh eyes and ask the kind of dumb, naive questions that make experts roll their eyes. Questions like, wait, why do we do it that way? What if we tried something completely different? So let me set the scene for you, because understanding what was happening in 1940 is crucial to grasping just how desperate and insane this whole situation was. Europe was on fire. Hitler's forces had conquered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and were pounding Britain into rubble with daily bombing raids. The British were standing alone against the Nazi war machine, and they were surviving on one thing: ships. Ships bringing food from America and Canada. Ships bringing weapons, ammunition, fuel, tanks, planes, everything needed to keep fighting. But here's the problem that was giving Winston Churchill nightmares. German U-boats were sinking those supply ships faster than Britain could replace them. Way faster. We're talking about a situation where merchant ships were going down by the dozen every single month. The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard, and the math was brutally simple. If the Germans kept sinking ships at the current rate, And if the Allies could only build replacements at the current pace, Britain would be starved into submission within months. The war would be over, Hitler would control all of Europe, and America would be facing a Nazi superpower alone. The British were so desperate that they came to America, hat in hand, begging for ships. Not asking, begging. And the American government knew they had to help, but there was one massive problem. American shipyards were already maxed out. Every traditional shipbuilder on both coasts was working at full capacity, and they still couldn't produce enough ships fast enough. The waiting lists were growing longer every day, and time was something the Allies absolutely did not have. This is where Henry Kaiser enters the picture, and I want you to understand just how audacious his move was. Kaiser had been watching this crisis unfold, and he saw an opportunity. He went to the British Purchasing Commission in 1940 with a proposal that made their jaws hit the floor. He would build 30 massive cargo ships for them, and he would do it faster and cheaper than any traditional shipyard in America. The British officials looked at his credentials and saw zero experience in shipbuilding. Zero. They asked him how he planned to accomplish this miracle, and Kaiser's response was basically, "Give me the contract, and I'll figure it out." The British, drowning in desperation, actually said yes. They had no choice. Every traditional shipyard had already told them it was impossible to speed up production. So they made a deal with this construction guy from California who promised the moon. Meanwhile, back in America, when word got out that Henry Kaiser had secured a contract to build 30 ships, the reaction from the shipbuilding industry was somewhere between outrage and hysterical laughter. These were men whose families had been building ships for generations. They understood the intricate craft of naval architecture, the precise calculations needed to make sure a ship wouldn't break in half in heavy seas, the million little details that separate a floating masterpiece from a steel coffin. And here comes this dam builder, this highway contractor, claiming he's going to just waltz into their industry and do their job better than they could. One shipyard owner was quoted in a maritime journal saying that Kaiser's ships would probably sink at the dock before they even reached the ocean, and that giving him a wartime contract was borderline criminal negligence. But Kaiser wasn't listening to the haters. He was too busy assembling a team of people who were just as crazy as he was. His chief lieutenant was a guy named Clay Bedford, and Bedford had just returned from a trip to Detroit, where he'd toured the Ford Motor Company's revolutionary assembly line. Bedford had watched in awe as Henry Ford's workers took what used to be a painstaking custom process, building automobiles, and turned it into a streamlined, standardized system where identical parts moved down a line and came out the other end as complete cars. And Bedford had an idea that probably sounded insane even to himself. What if we built ships the same way Ford builds cars? Now stop and think about that for a second. A ship isn't a car. A car weighs a couple of tons. A Liberty ship weighs 14,000 tons. A car is assembled from maybe 20,000 parts. A Liberty ship has over 30,000 tons of steel plates, frames, and components, all of which have to be precisely fitted together, or the entire structure will fail catastrophically the first time it hits rough seas. Comparing shipbuilding to automobile manufacturing was like comparing building a sandcastle to constructing the Empire State Building. It was absurd. It was naive. It was the kind of idea that only someone who didn't understand shipbuilding could come up with. And that's exactly why it worked. See, traditional shipbuilders had inherited their methods from centuries of maritime tradition. They built ships the way their fathers built ships, and their grandfathers before them. You started with a keel, the spine of the ship, laid down on a slipway. Then you slowly, painstakingly built up from there, adding frames and ribs, then attaching steel plates one at a time, joining them with rivets. Thousands upon thousands of rivets. A single Liberty ship required over 1 million rivets, each. One heated red-hot, hammered into place by a two-man team. One guy holding the rivet, another pounding it with a pneumatic hammer. It was skilled work, brutal work, and it took forever. Kaiser looked at this process and had what can only be described as a moment of beautiful, disruptive clarity. He asked the simplest, most obvious question that apparently no one in the shipbuilding industry had seriously considered. Why are we still using rivets? The traditional shipbuilders had an answer ready. Because that's how you build a ship. Rivets have worked for over a century. They're tested, they're reliable, they're proven. Welding is unreliable, brittle, and dangerous for hull construction. The British Navy literally has regulations forbidding welding on warship hulls because welded seams can crack under stress. Kaiser listened to all of this, nodded thoughtfully, and then said something that probably made every naval architect in the room want to strangle him. Okay, but what if we just welded them anyway? The reaction was immediate and explosive. Welding a ship? That was reckless, unproven, and potentially suicidal. Sure, you could use some welding for internal structures, but the hull? The actual shell that keeps the ocean from pouring in and drowning everyone aboard? That had to be riveted by skilled craftsmen who understood the critical importance of their work. But Kaiser wasn't some reckless cowboy just throwing darts at a board. He'd done his homework, or rather his engineers had. They'd studied the latest welding technology, and they understood something that the traditional shipbuilders were too set in their ways to accept. Welding technology had improved dramatically in the past decade. Modern arc welding, done correctly, could actually produce seams that were stronger and more watertight than riveted joints. Plus, and this was the kicker, welding was way faster than riveting. A welder could join steel plates in a fraction of the time it took a riveting crew. And here's the really revolutionary part. You could train someone to be a competent welder in weeks, while training a master riveter took years. Now, let me pause here because I want you to hit that like button if you're following this story and your mind is starting to get blown by just how radical Kaiser's thinking was. Seriously, that little thumbs up tells YouTube that this video is worth showing to more people, and it literally takes you half a second. Click it right now, and then we're going to get into how Kaiser convinced the government to let him try his crazy plan. And trust me, this is where things get really good. Okay, so Kaiser's got this wild idea to weld ships together instead of riveting them, to use assembly line techniques instead of traditional craft methods. But he still needed to convince the people who mattered: the U.S. Maritime Commission and the Navy. These weren't just any bureaucrats. These were hard-nosed, extremely skeptical military and shipping experts who had seen every con artist and snake oil salesman try to pitch them miracle solutions. They'd heard it all, and they weren't about to gamble America's wartime shipping capacity on some construction magnate's half-baked theory. The head of the Maritime Commission was a vice admiral named Emery Scott Land, and this guy was old-school Navy through and through. He'd spent his entire career around ships, and he knew the industry inside and out. When Kaiser came to him with his proposal to build ships using welding and assembly line methods, Land's initial reaction was basically, "Who the hell is this guy, and why is he wasting my time?" Land didn't trust civilians in general, and he especially didn't trust civilians who thought they could do the Navy's job better than the Navy could. But here's the thing that saved Kaiser's pitch. Admiral Land was also a realist, and he could do math. The numbers were undeniable and terrifying. At the current production rate, with traditional shipyards taking 230 days per ship, the Allies were going to lose the Battle of the Atlantic. Period. End of story. The U-boats were winning, and unless someone figured out how to dramatically increase ship production, Britain was going to fall, and then America would be facing Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan with no allies and no forward bases. The stakes couldn't have been higher, so Land found himself in an impossible position. Every instinct, every bit of training and experience told him that Kaiser's plan was reckless and probably doomed to fail. But the alternative was certain defeat. So he made a decision that took real courage. He gave Kaiser a shot. Not a big shot. The initial contract was relatively small, a test to see if this maniac could actually deliver. But it was enough to get started. Kaiser immediately moved to Richmond, California, a mudflat on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay that had absolutely nothing going for it except cheap land and deep water access. And he started building not just a shipyard, but something that had never existed before: a ship manufacturing plant. The difference is crucial. A shipyard is organized around the craft of shipbuilding, with skilled workers moving around a single ship, building it piece by piece in place. Kaiser's facility was organized like a factory, with different stations building different parts of ships simultaneously, and the parts only coming together at the very end. The layout alone was revolutionary and looked completely wrong to anyone from the traditional shipbuilding world. Instead of slipways where ships were built from keel to launch in one spot, Kaiser's yard had massive open areas where prefabricated sections would be constructed. He installed giant gantry cranes, the kind used in heavy industrial plants, that could lift 150-ton sections of ship and move them around like toys. When maritime engineers toured the facility during construction, they were baffled and horrified in equal measure. This wasn't a shipyard. This was some kind of bizarre industrial experiment that seemed to miss the entire point of how ships were supposed to be built. But Kaiser wasn't trying to build ships the right way. He was trying to build them the fast way, and he understood something fundamental about manufacturing that the craftsmen didn't. Complexity is the enemy of speed and scale. The traditional method of shipbuilding was incredibly complex, requiring highly skilled workers making thousands of individual decisions and adjustments. Every ship was slightly different because it was essentially handcrafted. Kaiser wanted to eliminate all that variation, all that skill requirement, and create a system where ships were identical products rolling off a production line. The ship they were going to build was called the Liberty ship, and it was based on a British design for a simple, sturdy cargo vessel. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fast, and it had none of the elegance of traditional ship design. President Franklin Roosevelt called them dreadful-looking objects. And he wasn't wrong. The Liberty ship was basically a floating steel box with an engine. But it could carry 2,500 tons of cargo. It could be built quickly and cheaply. And most importantly, it could be built by workers who weren't master craftsmen. This was Kaiser's second revolutionary insight: the workforce problem. Traditional shipyards recruited from a small, elite pool of skilled craftsmen, men who'd spent years as apprentices learning the trade. But there weren't enough of these guys to go around, especially now that the military was drafting workers left and right. Kaiser's solution was so simple it was almost insulting to the professionals. What if we just trained regular people to do it? So Kaiser put out help-wanted ads across the entire country. The ads promised high wages, good working conditions, and most revolutionary of all, they promised to train anyone willing to work, regardless of background or experience. The response was overwhelming. People flooded into Richmond, California from all over America. Former farmers from the Midwest, secretaries from New York, housewives from small towns who'd never worked outside the home, African Americans from the South who'd been locked out of good-paying industrial jobs their entire lives, women who'd been told that heavy industry wasn't appropriate work for ladies. Kaiser didn't care about any of that. He didn't care about your resume or your pedigree. If you could show up, follow instructions, and work hard, you were hired. And this diverse, inexperienced workforce was about to prove something that would reshape American industry forever. Given the right system and the right training, ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. But here's where Kaiser's genius really shines through, and this is something that modern business schools still study today. He didn't try to train these people to be traditional shipbuilders. He didn't put them through 4-year apprenticeships to learn every aspect of the craft. Instead, he broke down shipbuilding into small, specific, repetitive tasks, and he trained each worker to do exactly one task really, really well. Let me give you an example of how radical this was. In a traditional shipyard, a master welder needed to know dozens of different welding techniques, needed to be able to work in any position, needed to understand metallurgy and stress analysis. Training a master welder took years. Kaiser didn't train master welders. He trained people to make one specific type of weld, in one specific position, on one specific type of joint. That's it. And you could train someone to do that one task proficiently in about 2 weeks. Now the traditional craftsmen were absolutely horrified by this approach. They saw it as a degradation of their craft, a dangerous dumbing down that would produce inferior, unsafe ships. One union representative called it the suicide of American shipbuilding and predicted that Kaiser's ships would sink, split apart, or fail catastrophically in heavy seas. But Kaiser pressed forward because he understood something about human capability that the elitists didn't. Most people are way more capable than we give them credit for. Put them in the right system, give them the right training and tools, and they'll surprise you. The training program was intense but focused. New workers would spend 2 weeks in welding school learning their specific task. They'd practice over and over on scrap metal until they could make their weld perfectly in their sleep. Then they'd be assigned to a work crew with experienced supervisors who'd make sure they were doing it right. And it worked. These farmers and secretaries and housewives started making welds that passed inspection. They weren't master craftsmen, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to be good at their specific job. Meanwhile, Kaiser's engineers were implementing the other half of his revolutionary vision, prefabrication. This was the heart of the assembly line approach, and it changed everything. In a traditional shipyard, you built a ship from the bottom up, in sequence. You couldn't install the engine until the engine room was built. You couldn't build the deck house until the deck was in place. Everything had to happen in order, one step at a time. Kaiser said, forget all that. His team designed the Liberty ship so it could be broken down into major sections. The bow, the stern, the bottom, the sides, the deck houses, the engine room. And here's the brilliant part. Each of those sections could be built separately, at the same time, in different parts of the yard. While one team was welding together the bow section over here, another team was building the stern section way over there, and a third team was assembling the deck house somewhere else entirely. When each section was complete, and we're talking about pieces that weighed 50 to 150 tons, those giant cranes would lift them up and move them to the main slipway, where they'd be welded together like massive steel Lego blocks. Do you see how revolutionary this was? Traditional shipbuilding was fundamentally sequential. Kaiser made it parallel. Instead of one task happening at a time, dozens of tasks were happening simultaneously. The time savings were exponential. And remember, we're talking about 14,000-ton ships being assembled from pieces the size of houses, lifted by cranes and joined together with precision that had to be perfect, or the whole thing would be a disaster. Now let me stop here for a second and tell you something important. If you're still watching, if you're this deep into the story, that means you're exactly the kind of person who appreciates deep, detailed storytelling about amazing historical events. And I've got dozens more stories just like this one. Stories about people who looked at impossible problems and found incredible solutions. But here's the thing. YouTube's algorithm is brutal. It only recommends videos to people who engage with them. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell icon. It takes 2 seconds. It's completely free, and it means you'll actually see our next video when it comes out. Plus, it genuinely helps us create more content like this. So do that right now, and then let's get back to the story, because we're about to get to the part where Kaiser's ships start hitting the water and everyone's minds start getting blown. Kaiser's first Liberty ship was laid down in early 1941, and this is where reality hit the optimistic projections. See, even with all the new methods and all the fresh workers, building a ship is still incredibly complex. There were learning curves, mistakes, delays, coordination problems. The first ship took 197 days from keel laying to launch. That was actually better than a lot of traditional shipyards, which was encouraging, but it was nowhere near fast enough to make a real difference in the war effort. At that pace, Kaiser's operation wasn't revolutionary, it was just slightly better than average. But Kaiser wasn't discouraged. He'd expected the first few ships to be slow. This was all about refining the system, learning from every mistake, optimizing every process. After each ship, his team would analyze what went wrong, what took too long, where the bottlenecks were. They'd adjust the training, reorganize the work crews, improve the prefabrication process. The second ship took 165 days. The third took 140 days. And the times kept dropping. By the time they were building their fifth ship, something remarkable was happening. The workers who'd been complete novices a few months earlier were now experienced professionals. The welders knew their welds. The crane operators knew exactly how to position the massive sections. The supervisors had learned how to coordinate the complex dance of hundreds of workers and dozens of concurrent tasks. The fifth ship took 128 days. The skeptics in the Navy were starting to pay attention. Then the 10th ship took 97 days, under 100 days for a complete Liberty ship. The traditional shipbuilders, who'd been so confident that Kaiser would fail spectacularly, were now watching in uncomfortable silence. This dam builder, this amateur, was actually doing it. He was actually building ships faster than they could, and he was still accelerating. By the spring of 1942, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard, which everyone had called a foolish experiment just a year earlier, was completing ships in 70 days. 70 days! They'd cut the traditional build time by 2/3, and they weren't producing junk either. These ships passed every Navy inspection. They sailed across the Atlantic. They carried their cargo. They survived German torpedoes and Atlantic storms. Kaiser's welded hulls, which the experts had predicted would crack and fail, were actually performing better than traditionally riveted ships in some respects. But here's where the story takes another turn. And honestly, this is where it starts to sound like fiction, except it's all completely documented and true. See, Kaiser hadn't just built one shipyard. He'd built 7 of them up and down the West Coast. Each one was using his methods, competing with each other to build ships faster. And when you put a bunch of competitive people in similar situations and give them a measurable goal, something interesting happens. They start racing. It started informally. Workers at the Richmond No. 2 yard heard that Richmond No. 1 had completed a ship in 65 days. So No. 2 decided they could do it in 60. Then the Portland, Oregon yards got into the competition. Then the shipyards in Vancouver, Washington joined in. Pretty soon, there was an all-out unofficial race happening across Kaiser's entire operation to see who could build a ship the fastest. The Navy was watching this with mixed feelings. On one hand, the competition was driving production times down at an incredible rate. Ships were now being completed in 50 days, then 45, then 42. The U.S. was starting to outproduce the German U-boats' ability to sink ships, which was exactly what needed to happen to win the Battle of the Atlantic. On the other hand, the Navy brass was worried that in the race for speed, quality might suffer. They were nervous about stunt ships that were rushed through just to set records, but might not be truly seaworthy. So after one of Kaiser's yards completed a ship in just 27 days, less than a month from keel to launch, the Navy sent down word, knock it off with the speed records. Build good ships at a reasonable pace, but stop trying to set records. This was serious wartime production, not a circus sideshow. The admirals wanted reliable ships, not headlines. Kaiser's management dutifully passed the message down to the yards. No more racing, no more stunts, just focus on steady, high-quality production. And for a few months, that's what happened. The shipyards settled into a rhythm, producing ships in a consistent 40 to 45 days, maintaining high-quality standards, keeping the Navy happy. Everything was running smoothly. The system was working exactly as designed. But then something happened that reignited the competitive fire, and this is where the story reaches its absolutely insane climax. A Navy admiral named Howard Vickery, who'd been one of the skeptics early on but had become impressed with Kaiser's operation, was giving an interview to a newspaper reporter. The reporter asked him about the speed records, whether they thought anyone could ever build a ship faster than 27 days. And Admiral Vickery, probably not thinking too hard about it, said something casual like, "Well, technically, if you had everything perfectly organized and pre-built, I suppose you could assemble a ship in a week or so. But that would just be assembly, not really construction. That interview was published in newspapers across the country. And at Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2, a manager named Bill Weisseth read that quote and saw it as a challenge. Not just any challenge, a personal challenge from a top Navy admiral. Weisseth's shipyard was the one that had previously held the record at 27 days before being told to stop. And now here was an admiral saying that a week was theoretically possible? Weisseth called his team together and said something to the effect of, "Boys, we've been told we can't set records anymore. But that was before an admiral basically dared us to build a ship in under a week. I think we need to show him what we can really do." Now, what happened next requires understanding just how insane the logistics were. Building a Liberty ship in 27 days was already considered a miracle. Doing it in under a week? That wasn't just fast. That was taking every single piece of the ship, pre-building it to near completion, and then basically clicking them all together like the world's most complicated and massive jigsaw puzzle. It would require months of preparation, perfect coordination, and a level of orchestration that would make a symphony conductor. Weisseth and his team spent weeks planning what they called the launch project. They picked a ship number, hull 440, and named it the SS Robert E. Peary, after the Arctic explorer, and they decided on a launch date, November 8, 1942. From that date, they worked backward, planning every single detail. Every single piece of the ship would be prefabricated to completion. The 140-ton engine would be fully assembled and tested. The bow section would be completely welded and painted, with the anchor and all hardware installed. The stern, the cargo holds, the deck houses, the smokestacks, the lifeboats, everything would be built and ready to go. The slipway where they'd assemble the ship would become just a final assembly point. They kept the plan relatively quiet because they didn't want to get shut down before they could attempt it. But as the date approached, word started leaking out. Journalists heard rumors. Other shipyards caught wind that Richmond No. 2 was planning something big. Naval inspectors started asking questions. And Kaiser's management, God bless them, decided to just let it happen. If the team thought they could do it, why not let them try? If they failed, well, it would be embarrassing, but not catastrophic. If they succeeded, it would be the ultimate proof that Kaiser's revolutionary methods were the future of shipbuilding. The clock officially started at 12:01 a.m. on November 8, 1942. And let me tell you, what happened over the next 4 days was one of the most impressive displays of human coordination and determination you'll ever hear about. Over 1,000 workers, organized into carefully coordinated shifts, worked around the clock. The slipway was illuminated by massive floodlights turning night into day. Every 15 minutes, a new major section was lifted by crane and moved into position. Welders swarmed over each joint, their arc welders sparking like fireworks. Inspectors followed right behind them, checking every weld because, despite the speed, quality couldn't be sacrificed. The Navy was watching, and this ship had to pass every standard inspection, or the whole thing would be declared a meaningless stunt. Crowds started gathering outside the shipyard fence, watching the floodlit spectacle. Journalists set up cameras and radio equipment. Naval officers flew in from Washington to observe. Executives from competing shipbuilding companies showed up, some hoping to see Kaiser's team fail, others genuinely curious if this was actually possible. The pressure was enormous. Everyone in the shipyard knew that the eyes of the nation, and really the eyes of the world, were on them. The bow section went on first, 150 tons lifted by crane and set onto the keel like a puzzle piece. Then the bottom sections, the side plates, the stern. The engine, fully assembled and tested, was lowered into the engine room in one piece. The deck houses were lifted on top. Hour by hour, this massive ship was taking shape not through gradual construction, but through rapid assembly. It looked less like traditional shipbuilding and more like watching a massive mechanical creature being assembled by an army of dedicated workers. There were problems, of course. At one point, a crane had mechanical trouble and lost 2 hours. A batch of welds failed inspection and had to be redone, costing precious time. A prefabricated section didn't quite fit right and needed adjustment. But the team pushed through every problem with focused intensity. Sleep was something that happened in short bursts between shifts. Meals were grabbed on the run. Every single person in that shipyard understood that they were attempting something that had never been done before, something that would either go down in history as an incredible achievement or a famous failure. Day 2 passed. The hull was complete and watertight. Day 3. The superstructure was going on. The smokestacks were being installed. The lifeboats were being mounted. Day 4. The final systems were being connected. The inspectors were doing their checks. The painters were finishing the last details. And everyone was watching the clock. The previous record was 27 days. They were going to obliterate that. But could they actually do it in under 5 days? The tension in the shipyard was incredible as the 4th day stretched into evening. Everything was coming together. The ship looked complete, but there were still systems to check, still inspections to pass, still final details to handle. The official launch wouldn't count until the ship was certified as complete and seaworthy by Navy inspectors and physically launched down the slipway into the water. Until that moment, the clock was still running. At 3:16 p.m. on November 12, 1942, just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the first keel plate had been laid, the SS Robert E. Peary was officially certified complete by Navy inspectors. The crowd that had gathered outside the shipyard erupted in cheers. Inside the yard, workers who'd barely slept in 4 days hugged each other, some crying from exhaustion and emotion. The ship, all 14,000 tons of it, was released from its blocks and slid down the slipway into San Francisco Bay. A fully functional Liberty ship that had been assembled faster than anyone thought possible. The news spread across the country like wildfire. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming to announce the achievement. Newspapers ran it as front-page news. The psychological impact was enormous, and not just in America. In Britain, where people were living under constant threat of starvation if the supply ships stopped coming, the news that America could now build a complete cargo ship in less than a week was an enormous morale boost. In Germany, Nazi propaganda ministers tried to dismiss it as American exaggeration, but German naval intelligence knew better. They knew that the Battle of the Atlantic had just fundamentally shifted. Vice Admiral Emery Land, the same guy who'd been so skeptical of Kaiser back in 1940, flew out to Richmond for the launch ceremony, and in front of the cameras and reporters, this hard-nosed Navy man who'd seen everything gave a speech that I wish I could quote verbatim, but I'll give you the essence of what he said. He talked about how 6 months ago he would have called this achievement impossible. He talked about how every traditional assumption about shipbuilding had been challenged and proven wrong. He talked about how Henry Kaiser, a man who knew nothing about ships, had made the entire naval establishment look foolish by simply asking, "Why not?" and then proving that it could be done. Land finished by saying that Kaiser had made traditional wisdom obsolete, and that the future of shipbuilding would be forever changed by what had happened in Richmond, California. Now here's what I want you to understand about the impact of this achievement, because it goes way beyond just one ship built really fast. The SS Robert E. Peary was a symbol, a proof of concept that shattered every assumption about manufacturing limitations. Other shipyards, the traditional ones that had mocked Kaiser, immediately sent their engineers to study his methods. Within months, yards across the country were adopting prefabrication, switching to welding, implementing assembly line techniques. The changes rippled through the entire industry. The results were staggering. Remember that the average build time when Kaiser started was 230 days? By mid-1943, the average across all American shipyards had dropped to 42 days. 42 days. The traditional shipbuilders had cut their production time by more than 80% by adopting the methods of the amateur they'd mocked. At peak production, American shipyards were launching 3 complete Liberty ships every single day. 3 per day? The Germans were sinking ships, but America was building them faster than they could be destroyed. By 1943, Allied shipping tonnage was actually increasing despite the U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over, and Kaiser's revolution in shipbuilding was a major reason why. In total, American shipyards built 2,610 Liberty ships during World War II. Kaiser's 7 shipyards alone produced 1,490 of them, more than half. These ships carried the tanks, planes, ammunition, food, and fuel that supplied the Allied armies in Europe and the Pacific. They carried the troops for D-Day. They supplied the Soviet Union through the dangerous Arctic convoys. Military historians generally agree that the Allied victory in World War II was fundamentally a victory of production and logistics, and Liberty ships were the backbone of that logistics network. Without them, D-Day doesn't happen. Without them, Britain falls. Without them, we're looking at a completely different world. But Kaiser's legacy goes way beyond just the ships. And this is where the story gets even more interesting because it touches on aspects of social change that were just as revolutionary as the manufacturing innovations. See, when Kaiser opened his shipyards and promised to train anyone willing to work, he wasn't just solving a labor shortage problem. He was accidentally, or maybe intentionally, depending on who you ask, launching a social revolution that would reshape American industry and society. Remember, this was 1941-1942. America was still heavily segregated. Women were expected to stay home and raise families. The idea that a housewife from Iowa or a black man from Alabama could walk into an industrial shipyard and within weeks be doing skilled labor that was critical to the war effort. That was radical. That was threatening to a lot of people who had very fixed ideas about who could do what kind of work. But Kaiser didn't care about any of that social baggage. He had ships to build, and he needed workers. So his recruitment ads went everywhere, and his hiring managers were told to take anyone who could do the job. The result was that Kaiser's shipyards became some of the most diverse workplaces in America. African Americans worked alongside white workers. Women operated cranes, did welding, supervised work crews. This wasn't some feel-good diversity initiative. This was pure pragmatism. Kaiser needed bodies, and he was willing to train anyone with the dedication to show up and work hard. And here's what happened that probably surprised even Kaiser. It worked spectacularly well. Those housewives everyone said couldn't handle industrial work, many of them became some of the most skilled and reliable welders in the yards. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real, and she was building Liberty ships in Richmond, California. Those African-American workers who'd been locked out of good industrial jobs by racism and discrimination. They proved they could do the work just as well as anyone else when given proper training and a fair chance. There's this one story I came across in my research that perfectly captures this. There was a woman named Inez Sauer, a secretary from New York who'd never done any kind of manual labor in her life. She saw Kaiser's ads promising good wages and interesting work. So she took a train across the country to Richmond. She went through the 2-week welding training program, got assigned to a work crew, and within 6 months, she was a lead welder supervising a team of 20 people. After the war, she was interviewed about her experience, and she said something that stuck with me. Before the shipyards, I thought I was capable of typing letters and answering phones. After the shipyards, I knew I was capable of anything. That sentiment was repeated thousands of times across Kaiser's workforce. People who'd been told their entire lives that they weren't smart enough, weren't strong enough, weren't the right gender or the right race to do important, skilled work. They proved all those assumptions wrong. And they didn't just prove it to the doubters. They proved it to themselves. The psychological and social impact of that experience rippled out for generations. Now, Kaiser being Kaiser, he didn't stop at just hiring these workers. He actually took care of them in ways that were revolutionary for the time. He built housing near the shipyards so workers didn't have to commute long distances. He set up childcare centers so mothers could work without worrying about their kids. And here's the big one that still impacts millions of Americans today. He created a comprehensive healthcare system for his workers. See, Kaiser had a problem. He had thousands of workers doing dangerous industrial labor. And if they got injured or sick, they couldn't work, and production suffered. The existing healthcare system was inadequate. Most workers didn't have health insurance, and industrial medicine was pretty primitive. So Kaiser, in typical fashion, decided to just create his own healthcare system from scratch. He hired a physician named Sidney Garfield, who had experience with prepaid healthcare plans, and together they built an integrated system of hospitals, clinics, and doctors that provided comprehensive care to all shipyard workers and their families for a small monthly fee. This wasn't charity. Kaiser understood that healthy workers were productive workers, and the investment in healthcare paid for itself in reduced absenteeism and better morale. But the system worked so well that after the war, it continued and expanded. That wartime healthcare system for shipyard workers evolved into Kaiser Permanente, which today is one of the largest non-profit healthcare organizations in America, serving over 12 million people. Every time you see a Kaiser Permanente hospital or clinic, you're looking at a legacy that traces directly back to Henry Kaiser's shipyards in World War II. But let's get back to the ships themselves, because there's an aspect of this story that I haven't fully explored yet, and it's important. The Liberty ships that Kaiser built weren't perfect. They had problems, some of them serious. The most famous issue was that some of the welded ships developed cracks in cold water. A few actually broke in half while at sea. The critics who'd warned that welded hulls were dangerous pointed to these failures as proof that they'd been right all along, that Kaiser's rush to build ships quickly had sacrificed safety. And you know what? They had a point. The welding technology, while generally sound, wasn't perfect. Some welders weren't as well trained as they should have been. Some welds were done in cold conditions that made the steel brittle. The rapid pace of production meant that some quality control issues slipped through. People died when those ships broke apart. That's a real tragedy, and it can't be glossed over in the rush to celebrate Kaiser's achievements. But here's the context that matters. Even with those failures, Kaiser's ships had a better overall survival rate than traditionally built ships. More Liberty ships were sunk by U-boats and enemy action than failed due to structural problems. And when problems were identified, Kaiser's team worked with metallurgists and naval architects to fix them. They modified the designs, improved the welding procedures, added steel reinforcements in critical areas. The later Liberty ships were significantly more reliable than the early ones because the system was constantly learning and improving. And here's the brutal calculus that Admiral Land and the Navy had to consider. Even if Kaiser's ships had a slightly higher failure rate than traditional ships, which wasn't actually proven, they were being produced so much faster that the overall impact on the war effort was massively positive. Would it have been better to have more reliable ships produced so slowly that Britain starved before they arrived? Or was it better to accept some increased risk in exchange for the quantity and speed that were literally winning the war? The Navy chose speed and quantity, and history suggests that was the right call. Now, I want to take a moment here to talk about what happened after the war, because that's where you really see the long-term impact of Kaiser's revolution. When World War II ended in 1945, the need for Liberty ships disappeared almost overnight. The government canceled orders, shipyards closed, and suddenly the largest shipbuilding operation in world history just stopped. Many of the Liberty ships themselves were mothballed, sold for scrap, or given away to foreign countries that needed cargo ships. Kaiser himself moved on to other ventures. He got into automobile manufacturing, trying to apply his assembly line innovations to cars. That venture was less successful. He eventually sold out to American Motors. He built steel mills, got into aluminum production, developed entire communities in places like Hawaii. He remained a major figure in American business until his death in 1967. But nothing he did after the war matched the sheer audacious impact of what he accomplished with those shipyards. However, the techniques he pioneered became the global standard for shipbuilding. Today, every modern ship is welded, not riveted. Every modern shipyard uses prefabrication and modular construction. The assembly line approach to complex manufacturing spread from ships to airplanes to basically every other large-scale industrial production. The management techniques, breaking complex tasks into simple, trainable components using parallel production instead of sequential, focusing on system optimization rather than individual craftsmanship, those ideas became foundational to modern manufacturing theory. There's a direct line from Kaiser's shipyards to the Toyota production system that revolutionized automobile manufacturing. There's a connection to modern supply chain management, to just-in-time manufacturing, to Six Sigma quality control. Every time you hear about some company disrupting an industry by applying new methods to old problems, that's echoing what Kaiser did in 1941. He was the original disruptor, the original guy who walked into an established industry and said, "You're all doing this wrong, and I can prove it." And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Kaiser proved that expertise can be a trap. The traditional shipbuilders knew so much about how ships had always been built that they couldn't imagine building them any other way. Their expertise blinded them to possibilities. Kaiser's ignorance freed him to ask obvious questions that no expert would ask because they knew the answers. Sometimes the most dangerous phrase in any industry is, "That's how we've always done it." Kaiser didn't know how it had always been done, so he was free to figure out how it should be done. Now, let me bring this full circle back to where we started, because I think there's a lesson in this story that applies to whatever you're doing with your life right now, whether you're building a business, pursuing a creative project, or just trying to solve some problem that everyone tells you is impossible. The experts told Kaiser he couldn't build ships because he didn't have the right background. He built them anyway, and he built them better than the experts. The Navy told him welding was too risky. He proved them wrong. The traditional shipbuilders said his methods would produce inferior products. The products won a war. Every step of the way, people who supposedly knew better told him his ideas were crazy, naive, dangerous, impossible. And every single time he ignored them and did it anyway. Not recklessly. Kaiser did his homework. He tested his ideas. He hired smart people and listened to their advice. But he didn't let traditional wisdom and conventional thinking limit what he attempted. He looked at what seemed impossible and asked, "But what if we tried anyway?" That 4-day, 15-hour, 29-minute ship wasn't just a manufacturing achievement. It was a statement about human potential. It was proof that when you remove artificial limitations, when you give people proper tools and training, and trust them to do important work, they'll accomplish things that seem miraculous. Those farmers and secretaries and housewives who built those ships didn't have decades of training. They had weeks of training, good leadership, an efficient system, and the determination to prove they could do it. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. Whatever problem you're facing, whatever impossible challenge someone has told you can't be done, maybe they're wrong. Maybe the only reason it seems impossible is because everyone's been doing it the wrong way. Maybe you're the outsider who's going to walk in with fresh eyes and see the obvious solution that all the experts missed. Because they were too close to it. Kaiser went from 0 ships to building one every 4 days because he wasn't constrained by how things had always been done. He was free to imagine how things could be done. And that freedom, that willingness to question everything and try new approaches, is available to you too. You don't need permission from the experts. You don't need decades of experience in an industry to see its problems clearly. Sometimes being an outsider is an advantage, but, and this is important, you do need to do the work. Kaiser succeeded not just because he had bold ideas, but because he executed them relentlessly. He built the shipyards. He trained the workers. He refined the systems. He dealt with every setback and kept pushing forward. He turned his crazy vision into detailed plans and then into physical reality. Bold ideas are meaningless without execution, and execution requires dedication, hard work, and the persistence to keep going when people are laughing at you. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you something. What part of Kaiser's story hit you the hardest? Was it the 4-day ship that still seems impossible even after I explained how they did it? Was it the social revolution of ordinary people proving they could do extraordinary work? Was it the sheer audacity of a man who knew nothing about ships walking in and revolutionizing the entire industry? Or was it something else? Maybe a specific detail or moment that resonated with your own experiences or challenges? Drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single comment on this channel, and I genuinely want to know what you think. This isn't just a one-way broadcast. This is a conversation, and your perspective matters. So take a moment, leave a comment, and let's talk about what we can learn from Henry Kaiser and his impossible ships. And listen, if you made it this far into what I'll admit is a pretty long video, that tells me you're the kind of person who appreciates deep, detailed storytelling. You're not looking for shallow, clickbait content. You want substance. You want the full story with all the fascinating details. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we do on this channel. We find these incredible historical stories that most people have never heard, and we tell them properly, with all the context and details that make them come alive. We've got videos about the engineer who saved 1 billion people from starvation with a breeding technique everyone said wouldn't work. We've got the story of the programmer who accidentally created a digital plague that taught scientists how real pandemics spread. We've got tales of scientific breakthroughs, engineering marvels, military innovations, and business revolutions that changed the world in ways most people never learned about in school. But here's the problem. YouTube's algorithm is incredibly fickle. It doesn't matter how good a video is if the algorithm doesn't show it to people. And the algorithm makes its decisions based on engagement, who's subscribing, who's watching, who's liking and commenting. So if you want to see more content like this, if you want to make sure YouTube actually shows you our next video, you need to subscribe right now. Click that button, hit the notification bell, and you'll be part of this community of people who love learning about the incredible things humans have accomplished. And while you're at it, hit that like button too. I know I've asked a couple times during this video, but it genuinely matters. YouTube sees those likes as a signal that people value this content, and it makes the algorithm more likely to recommend the video to others. You clicking that thumbs up literally helps other people discover these stories. So if you think Henry Kaiser's story deserves to be heard, if you think more people should know about the Liberty ships and how they were built, show it by hitting that like button right now. Now, let me leave you with one final thought about Kaiser and his legacy, because I think this is the real heart of the story. Henry Kaiser died in 1967 at the age of 85. By then, most of the Liberty ships he'd built were long gone, scrapped, sunk, or rotting in ship graveyards. The shipyards themselves had been torn down or repurposed. Physical traces of his wartime achievement were disappearing. But the real legacy wasn't the ships. It was the proof that ordinary people, given the right system and the right opportunity, can achieve extraordinary things. It was the demonstration that questioning conventional wisdom and trying new approaches can lead to breakthrough innovations. It was the validation that being an outsider isn't a disadvantage. Sometimes, it's exactly what's needed to see solutions that insiders can't. Somewhere right now, there's probably someone working on a problem that experts say is impossible. Maybe they're trying to make renewable energy affordable, or cure a disease, or solve some engineering challenge, or build a business that everyone says can't work. And those experts are probably right, based on current methods and conventional thinking. But maybe, just maybe, there's a better way that no one's tried yet. Maybe the person who figures it out won't be a credentialed expert with decades of experience. Maybe it'll be an outsider who doesn't know enough to realize it's supposed to be impossible. That's Kaiser's real legacy. Not the ships, but the reminder that impossible is often just another word for no one's figured it out yet. And sometimes all it takes is someone naive enough, bold enough, and determined enough to try anyway. The SS Robert E. Peary, that 4-day ship, sailed for years after the war, carrying cargo around the world. It survived storms, heavy seas, and the wear and tear of hard use. It eventually was scrapped in 1963, 2 decades after it was built in less than a week. In those 20 years, it proved that Kaiser's critics were wrong about everything. It proved that revolutionary methods could produce lasting results. And it stood as a floating reminder that when someone tells you something is impossible, they might just be wrong. So whatever your impossible goal is, whatever people are telling you can't be done, maybe you should take a lesson from Henry Kaiser. Study the problem. Question the assumptions. Find people who believe in the vision. Build the systems that make success possible. And then just do the work, day after day, until you prove the doubters wrong. Because that's what Kaiser did. He looked at an impossible problem, building ships faster than anyone thought possible. And he just figured it out, step by step, innovation by innovation, until the impossible became routine. And if a 58-year-old dam builder who'd never built a ship in his life could revolutionize an entire industry and help win the most important war in human history, what does that say about what you might be capable of if you're willing to try? All right, that's where I'm going to leave this story. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Seriously, if you're still here, you're amazing, and you're exactly the kind of engaged viewer that makes creating these videos worthwhile. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you thought, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll dive into another incredible story that deserves to be told. Until then, remember, impossible is just a word. The SS Robert E. Peary proved that. Henry Kaiser proved that. And maybe you'll prove it too. Picture this. April 7, 1945. The Pacific Ocean erupts with a force so violent that American pilots 20 miles away feel their cockpits shake. A mushroom cloud, black as death itself, punches through the sky, climbing higher and higher until it towers 4 miles above the water. 4 miles. That's not a bomb going off. That's not some munitions depot on a beach somewhere. That's a battleship. The Yamato. 72,000 tons of Japanese steel, the most powerful warship ever constructed by human hands, just ceased to exist in a single apocalyptic instant. But here's what's gonna mess with your head. That explosion? That moment of total annihilation? That was actually a mercy compared to the 2 hours of absolute hell that came before it. 3,000 men trapped on a floating fortress, watching the sky turn black with enemy aircraft, knowing with absolute certainty that they were sailing into their own grave. One survivor, decades later, his hands still shaking as he spoke, said something that'll haunt you. He said, "They didn't order us to fight. They ordered us to die with her." And we saluted and said yes. How does that happen? How does the mightiest warship ever built, a vessel that took 5 years and the resources of an entire empire to construct, get torn apart in a single afternoon by wave after wave of American aircraft? How do you lose 3,000 men, an entire generation of Japan's finest sailors, in less time than it takes to watch a baseball game? And here's the real kicker. The thing that's gonna make this story stick with you long after this video ends. Why did Japan send her out there in the first place? Because they knew. The admirals knew. The captains knew. The sailors writing goodbye letters to families they'd never see again. They knew. This wasn't a battle. It was a sacrifice, a ritual, a suicide mission dressed up in the language of honor. This isn't just about a ship sinking, folks. This is about the collision of two completely different philosophies of war. This is about how empires rise and fall, not just because of weapons or tactics, but because of ideas. Wrong ideas. Fatal ideas. Ideas that get 3,000 men killed before they can even fire a shot at the enemy. Stick with us, because what you're about to hear is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II naval warfare. And if stories like this get your blood pumping, if you're the kind of person who needs to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, hit that subscribe button right now. Because we're not here to give you surface-level history. We're here to take you into the heart of the storm, to show you the human beings behind these massive machines, and to make you feel what they felt as their world literally exploded around them. Now let's rewind. Let's go back to understand how we got to that mushroom cloud. Because the Yamato's death? That started long before she ever left port on her final voyage. It started with an idea, a doctrine, a belief system that was already obsolete before the first rivet was hammered into her hull. The Japanese called it Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. And if you're thinking that sounds dramatic, you don't know the half of it. This wasn't just a military strategy. This was almost religious in its intensity. The Japanese Naval War College had been teaching this doctrine for decades, hammering it into the minds of every officer who passed through their halls. The idea was simple, seductive, and absolutely fatal. One massive fleet engagement, one colossal clash of titans. All your battleships, all your firepower, concentrated in one apocalyptic showdown where one side would be completely and utterly annihilated, and the other would rule the Pacific forever. Think about what that means for a second. Your entire naval strategy, your whole approach to controlling the ocean, hinges on one single battle. Not a campaign, not a war of attrition, not island hopping or supply line interdiction or any of the things that actually win wars. No, just one glorious, thunderous clash where the gods of war would pick their favorite and deliver total victory. It's like putting all your chips on a single spin of the roulette wheel, except the chips are the lives of tens of thousands of sailors and the future of your empire. And the Yamato? She was their ace in the hole, their ultimate weapon, their promise from the gods themselves. When Japanese naval architects sat down in the mid-1930s to design her, they weren't just building a ship. They were building a statement. They were building a middle finger to every other navy on Earth. 18.1-inch guns. Let me put that in perspective for you. Those barrels were wider than a manhole cover. The shells they fired weighed 3,200 pounds each. That's more than a car, a full-sized car. And these shells could fly 25 miles, which is the distance from downtown Manhattan to JFK Airport, and when they hit something, they'd punch through over 2 feet of steel armor like it was tissue paper. The armor on Yamato herself? 16 inches thick in some places. 16 inches of hardened steel. You could park a motorcycle sideways in the thickness of her armor belt. American battleships had 12-inch armor, maybe 14 if they were really beefed up. Yamato's designers looked at that and said, "Cute, we're going bigger." They genuinely believed, and I mean this with absolute sincerity, that they had created something invincible. They called her the ship that couldn't be sunk. Some sailors, in hushed whispers, called her the floating shrine, because to them she represented everything sacred about the Japanese warrior spirit, hammered into steel form. But here's where the story gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean tragic in a way that makes your stomach turn. While Japan was pouring every resource they had into building these massive battleship cathedrals, the Americans were doing something completely different, something that would change warfare forever. They were building runways, floating runways, aircraft carriers. See, American naval doctrine had evolved in a totally different direction, and it happened for the most American reason imaginable. Practicality. Cold, hard, ruthless practicality. American admirals looked at battleships and they saw a problem. Sure, they're powerful. Sure, they're impressive. But they can only fight what they can see. And they can only see about 20 miles on a clear day. After that, the curvature of the Earth means you're shooting blind. So you've got these incredibly expensive, incredibly powerful weapons systems that can only project force in a tiny bubble around themselves. That's not dominance. That's a limitation. But an aircraft carrier? That's a different beast entirely. An aircraft carrier doesn't fight. It births fighters. It sends out aircraft that can fly 200 miles, 300 miles, find the enemy, bomb the enemy, sink the enemy, and fly back home, all while the carrier itself stays safe over the horizon. You're not limited by the range of your guns anymore. You're only limited by the range of your aircraft and the skill of your pilots, and America had plenty of both. This wasn't just a tactical difference. This was a fundamental philosophical split about what naval power even means. The Japanese saw the battleship as the ultimate expression of national will. The bigger your guns, the thicker your armor, the more powerful your empire. It was almost feudal in its logic. Your champion battleship faces off against their champion battleship, and whoever wins gets to claim dominance. It's the modern version of sending out your best samurai to duel their best knight. The Americans? They saw war as a math problem, a logistics challenge, a question of how to deliver the maximum amount of explosives to the enemy while keeping your own men as safe as possible. There's no honor in it, no poetry, no ritual. It's just cold calculation. If you can kill the enemy from 300 miles away, you don't need to get close enough for a fair fight. And fair fights are for suckers anyway, because fair fights get your sailors killed. One Japanese admiral, after the war, when he was trying to process what had happened, said something that I think captures this better than anything else. He said, We built castles while the Americans built clouds, and clouds can drown castles. That's not just a poetic metaphor. That's an admission of strategic failure at the highest level. That's an admiral looking back and realizing his entire navy was designed to fight a war that would never happen, while the enemy was fighting a war he couldn't even conceive of. And here's the kicker that makes this whole thing even more heartbreaking. The Japanese knew about aircraft carriers. They weren't blind to the technology. They had carriers of their own. In fact, Pearl Harbor, Japan's most famous military operation, was a carrier strike. They sent 6 carriers loaded with aircraft across the Pacific and launched a surprise attack that crippled the American battle fleet. It worked perfectly. It was a triumph of carrier aviation. The Japanese Navy proved, beyond any shadow of doubt, that aircraft carriers were the future of naval warfare. And then they proceeded to keep building battleships anyway. They kept pouring resources into big guns and thick armor, even after they had demonstrated that aircraft could sink battleships, while the battleships couldn't even fight back. It's like inventing the machine gun and then deciding to charge across no man's land with swords anyway because swords are more honorable. Why? Why would you do that? And this is where we have to understand something crucial about Japanese military culture in the 1940s. The battleship wasn't just a weapons system. It was a symbol. It was the physical embodiment of Bushido, the warrior code that had defined Japanese military thinking for centuries. A battleship stood tall, faced its enemies head-on, and traded blow for blow until one side or the other fell. That's how samurai fought. That's how men of honor fought. Sneaking around the horizon, launching aircraft to do your fighting for you while you stayed safe miles away? That felt like cowardice. That felt like dishonor, even though it was objectively better tactics, even though it saved lives and won battles. It violated something deep in the cultural DNA of the Japanese officer corps. And so when the Yamato slipped into the water in August 1941, she was already a ghost, a relic, a monument to a way of war that was dying even as she was being born. 4 months later, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and proved decisively that battleships were obsolete. The age of the battleship was over before Yamato ever fired a shot in anger. But nobody in the Japanese Navy wanted to admit that. Because admitting that would mean admitting that they'd wasted years and unimaginable resources building a ship that was useless. It would mean admitting that the entire foundation of their naval strategy was wrong. It would mean questioning decades of doctrine, centuries of warrior tradition. And institutions don't do that. Institutions double down. They find reasons why the old way is still valid. They convince themselves that one more big push, one more decisive engagement, will prove that they were right all along. Meanwhile, on the American side, pilots were learning a completely different creed. Survive, adapt, overwhelm. There was no romance in it, no talk of glorious last stands or honorable defeat. American carrier pilots were trained like factory workers, mass-produced in training programs that churned out hundreds of aviators a month. The focus was on teamwork, coordination, overwhelming firepower. One pilot wasn't expected to be a hero. One pilot was expected to be one part of a massive machine that worked together to obliterate the enemy. And it worked. Oh man, did it work! By 1944, the difference was so stark, it was almost embarrassing. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese aircraft attacked the American fleet in wave after wave. They were brave. They were dedicated. They flew their aircraft with skill and courage, and they got absolutely slaughtered. American combat air patrols shot down nearly 350 Japanese aircraft in a single day, while losing only 29 of their own. It wasn't a battle. It was target practice. One American pilot wrote home to his family saying, "It was not a battle, it was slaughter. They kept coming and we kept shooting and they kept falling into the ocean. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. That's what superior doctrine looks like. That's what happens when you bring an outdated philosophy to a modern war. You get massacred. And the scary thing, the thing that should make your blood run cold, is that Japanese Naval Command knew this. They saw the casualty reports. They saw their carrier fleet getting decimated. They saw their experienced pilots dying faster than they could be replaced. They knew they were losing the war in the air and on the sea, and they kept fighting anyway. Because what else were they going to do? Surrender? Admit defeat? That was unthinkable. So they doubled down. They invented new tactics like kamikaze attacks, turning their pilots into guided missiles because they couldn't win with conventional tactics anymore. And they made plans for one last desperate throw of the dice. One final attempt to matter, to make a difference, to go down swinging rather than fade into irrelevance. That plan had a name, Operation Tengo, and at the center of that plan was the Yamato. By April 1945, Japan was on the ropes. The Americans had taken Iwo Jima. They were closing in on Okinawa, which is basically Japan's doorstep, only 340 miles from the home islands. If Okinawa fell, Japan would be wide open for invasion. American bombers would be able to reach every city. American ships would control the waters right off the Japanese coast. The war would be over, so Japanese High Command came up with Operation Tengo, the heavenly operation. And I want you to understand just how insane this plan was, because it's going to explain everything about what happened next. The plan was this: send the Yamato, the pride of the fleet, the most powerful battleship ever built, on a one-way trip to Okinawa. Beach her on the shore. Let her become a stationary fortress, an unsinkable gun platform that would blast American landing forces and support ships until every last shell was expended. Then, when the ammunition ran out, the surviving crew would abandon ship and fight as ground troops until they were all dead. There was no plan for Yamato to return. There was no fuel for a return trip. The ship was given enough fuel to reach Okinawa, and that was it. This wasn't a naval operation. This was a sacrifice. A ritual suicide on a national scale. 3,000 men sent to certain death. Not because it would change the outcome of the war, but because somebody in Tokyo decided that dying gloriously was better than accepting defeat. And everybody knew it. That's the part that's gonna mess with your head. This wasn't some secret that was kept from the crew. Admiral Seiichi Ito, the commander of the operation, knew it was suicide. He argued against it. He told his superiors it was madness, that they'd be sending Japan's finest sailors to die for nothing, that Yamato would never even reach Okinawa before American aircraft tore her apart. His superiors basically told him to shut up and follow orders. So he did, because that's what Japanese officers did. You followed orders even when the orders were insane. Especially when the orders were insane, because dying while following insane orders was more honorable than refusing and living. The sailors knew too. Below decks, men wrote letters they knew would never be mailed. They said goodbye to parents, to wives, to children they'd never see grow up. One gunner, a kid barely 20 years old, wrote in his diary, and this was found on his body when they recovered it from the ocean. He wrote, "I will fire my guns until I cannot see the enemy anymore, until the smoke blinds me and the deck burns beneath my feet, until the ocean reaches up and takes me. I am not afraid. Or maybe I am, but it doesn't matter. This is my duty. This is how I serve the emperor. Mother, please forgive me for not coming home." What do you even say to that? What do you say to a kid who knows he's been sentenced to death and accepts it because his culture, his training, his entire worldview tells him that this is right and proper and honorable? It's heartbreaking. And it's infuriating. Because he didn't need to die. None of them needed to die. But they were going to anyway because old men in Tokyo needed to feel like they'd gone down fighting. Now, before we get to the actual battle, before we watch the Yamato's final hours play out in all their horrific glory, I need you to do something for me. If this story is gripping you, if you're sitting there thinking, "Holy crap, I can't believe this happened," hit that like button right now. It takes half a second and it tells YouTube that this is the kind of deep dive, no BS history content that people want to see. And if you're not already subscribed, what are you waiting for? We're bringing you stories like this every week. Military history that doesn't just tell you what happened, but makes you understand why it happened and what it felt like to be there. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get back to it. April 6, 1945. Yamato departs from Tokuyama Harbor along with 8 destroyers. Not an escort fleet, pallbearers. That's what one historian called them, and I think that's exactly right. They weren't there to protect Yamato. They were there to share her fate. Each destroyer had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. Each captain knew he was sailing to his death. And they went anyway. Can you imagine standing on the dock watching that fleet sail away? Knowing that every single person on those ships, thousands of men, were going to be dead in less than 48 hours? People did watch. Civilians, other sailors, officers who were staying behind. And they cried. They saluted. They waved goodbye to men they knew they'd never see again. On Yamato's bridge, Admiral Ito stood in silence, watching the coast of Japan disappear behind them. Officers around him maintained rigid discipline, but you could see it in their eyes. The knowledge, the certainty. They were sailing into history, but not the kind of history anyone wants to be part of. The Americans knew they were coming. Of course they knew. American submarines had spotted the task force almost immediately. Patrol aircraft tracked their every move. By the time Yamato cleared Japanese waters, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher already had the full picture. They knew exactly where Yamato was, what speed she was making, and where she was heading. The Japanese were trying to launch a surprise attack, and the Americans were reading their mail before they even sent it. Mitcher didn't hesitate. He unleashed Task Force 58, one of the most powerful carrier battle groups ever assembled. We're talking about 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, hundreds of aircraft, Grumman F-6F Hellcats for air superiority and strafing, Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers for dive bombing, Grumman TBF Avengers for torpedo runs. Each aircraft loaded for bear, armed to the teeth, and flown by pilots who'd been doing this for years. These weren't rookies. These were combat veterans who'd survived battles from Midway to Leyte Gulf. They knew their business. The plan was simple and brutal. Find the Yamato. Swarm her. Overwhelm her defenses. Sink her. There would be no honorable duel, no fair fight, no chance for the Japanese to prove their battleship superiority. Just cold, merciless, industrial-scale violence delivered from the sky. On the morning of April 7th, Yamato's lookouts spotted the scout planes. American aircraft circling just out of range, watching, tracking, radioing coordinates back to the carriers. The moment every man on that ship had been dreading had arrived. Admiral Ito ordered battle stations. Watertight doors sealed. Damage control teams stood ready. Gun crews loaded shells and prepared for the fight of their lives. And then they waited. Because that's the worst part, isn't it? The waiting. Knowing that death is coming but not knowing when. Not knowing if it'll be quick or slow, painless or agonizing. Just standing at your post, watching the horizon, listening for the sound of aircraft engines. At 10:20 a.m., the sound came. A drone at first, distant but growing. Then louder. Then deafening. The sky didn't darken gradually. It erupted all at once. Over 280 American aircraft, possibly as many as 386 depending on which source you trust, descended on the Yamato task force like locusts. The scale of it was beyond comprehension. Imagine looking up and seeing hundreds of aircraft, so many that they block out patches of the sky, all diving toward you with the single-minded purpose of killing you. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened up immediately. 152 barrels of various calibers, from 25mm machine guns to 127mm cannons, all firing at once. The sound was apocalyptic. The ship transformed into a volcano of fire and steel, spewing shells into the sky at a rate of thousands per minute. Tracers lit up the air. Explosions blossomed as shells found their marks, and American aircraft disintegrated in mid-flight. But here's the thing about swarming tactics. It doesn't matter if you shoot down 10 aircraft or 20 or even 50. When there are 300 coming at you, shooting down a few dozen is like trying to stop a tidal wave by throwing rocks at it. You might knock out a few drops, but the wave is still going to crash over you and drag you under. The Americans weren't flying random attack patterns either. They had a system, a deadly choreography that they'd practiced and perfected over years of carrier warfare. First came the Hellcat fighters, the reapers as some pilots called them. Their job wasn't to sink the ship. Their job was to kill the men trying to defend it. 6 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft, each gun firing 850 rounds per minute. They came in low and fast, strafing Yamato's decks, shredding anti-aircraft gun crews, killing rangefinders and spotters, turning the open deck areas into killing zones. Within minutes, Yamato's defensive fire started to slacken as crews were cut down, and guns fell silent. Then came the dive bombers, the hammers, Curtiss Helldivers loaded with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. They climbed high, positioned themselves, and then dropped nearly vertical, screaming down at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, releasing their bombs at the last possible second before pulling up. The bombs weren't aimed at the armored belt or the main turrets. They were aimed at the superstructure, the radar arrays, the fire control systems. Each hit sent shrapnel ripping through crew quarters and knocked out another piece of Yamato's ability to fight back. One bomb punched through the deck near the aft secondary turrets and detonated inside, killing dozens of men instantly and starting fires that would rage for the next hour. Another hit near the bridge, close enough that Admiral Ito and his staff were thrown from their feet by the blast. The ship's communications system started failing. Orders couldn't get through. Damage reports weren't reaching the bridge. Yamato was being systematically blinded and deafened. And then came the executioners. The torpedo bombers. Grumman Avengers flying so low their propellers nearly touched the wave tops, threading through the storm of anti-aircraft fire, pilots with nerves of steel holding their course as shells burst around them and machine gun rounds pinged off their armor. They had one job: put a torpedo into Yamato's hull below the waterline, punch through that armor belt and let the ocean in. The first torpedo hit at 12:46 p.m. on Yamato's port side, just forward of the main turrets. The ship shuddered. Not a violent explosion, not yet. Just a deep, resonating thump that you felt in your bones more than heard. Then another torpedo hit. Then another. Then another. Port side, all of them hitting the port side, and that was deliberate. The American pilots had learned that if you put all your torpedoes on one side of a ship, you create an asymmetric flooding problem that's almost impossible to solve. The ship starts to list, to tilt, and once she starts tilting, she can't stop. Yamato began to roll to port, slowly at first, just a few degrees. But in the damage control center, officers saw the indicators and felt their blood turn to ice. They knew what was coming. They knew what had to be done. Counter-flooding. The most horrific emergency procedure in naval warfare. Here's how it works. Your ship is flooding on one side and starting to list. If the list gets too severe, the ship will capsize and everyone dies. So you intentionally flood compartments on the opposite side to balance the weight. You let water into sealed sections of your own ship, sections that contain men, living men, your own crew. The order was given. Valves were opened on the starboard side. Water rushed into compartments that seconds before had been dry and safe. Men who'd been standing at their posts or helping wounded crewmates suddenly heard the roar of incoming seawater. Some compartments had time to evacuate. Some didn't. In the lower engineering spaces, men trapped by jammed hatches beat on the steel bulkheads as the water rose around them. Their crewmates on the other side could hear them screaming, and there was nothing they could do. One survivor later said, and these words are going to stick with you. He said, "We killed our brothers with our own hands just to keep the monster breathing for a few more minutes. I can still hear them. Late at night, when it's quiet, I can still hear them pounding on the steel." The counter-flooding worked, sort of. Yamato's list stabilized at around 5 degrees, but the ship was now heavier, sitting lower in the water, slower, less maneuverable. She'd gone from a racehorse to a wounded elephant, and the Americans weren't done with her. Not even close. The second wave hit at 1 p.m. Another 100 aircraft, fresh from the carriers, fully loaded. They saw Yamato limping through the water, smoke pouring from a dozen fires. Her speed dropped to barely 12 knots. She was a wounded animal, and they were the pack of wolves moving in for the kill. More torpedoes slammed into that ravaged port side. The torpedo belt, 16 inches of steel designed to absorb and deflect torpedoes, had already been breached. Now the warheads were exploding directly against the hull, ripping open compartments, sending seawater cascading through entire sections of the ship. The list returned worse than before. 8 degrees, 10 degrees. Counterflooding couldn't fix this. There wasn't enough intact space on the starboard side left to flood. Bombs continued to rain down. The aft turret took a direct hit that jammed its rotation mechanism. The forward turret's rangefinder was destroyed. Fire broke out in the crew quarters below the main deck, and the smoke was so thick that men were suffocating before the flames reached them. Medical stations overflowed with wounded. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia because supplies had run out. Men with burns covering half their bodies waited for treatment that would never come. And through it all, through the explosions and the fires, and the screaming and the dying, some men stayed at their posts. Gun crews kept firing even as aircraft strafed their positions. Engineers stayed below decks trying to keep the engines running even as the water rose around them. Officers on the bridge maintained their composure even as the deck tilted beneath their feet. And they knew, absolutely knew, that they had minutes left to live. Why? Why stay? Why not run? Why not try to save yourself? And the answer is complicated and simple at the same time. Training, duty, pride, fear of dishonor. But also, and I think this might be the most important part, because everyone else was staying. If your buddy at the next gun is still firing, how do you abandon him? If the officer beside you is still giving orders in a calm voice, even though his uniform is soaked with someone else's blood, how do you break and run? You stay because everyone else is staying. You die because everyone else is dying, and in some twisted way, that makes it bearable. The third wave arrived at 1:40 p.m. By now, Yamato wasn't even trying to evade. She couldn't. She was barely moving, listing heavily to port, fires visible from 30 miles away. But the American pilots weren't taking chances. They'd seen damaged ships fight back before. They'd seen dead carriers launch one last desperate aircraft strike. They weren't going to get complacent. More torpedoes, more bombs, hitting a ship that was already beaten, already dying, but hitting her anyway because that's what you do in war. You don't stop until the enemy is not just defeated, but annihilated. You don't take chances. You don't show mercy. You finish the job. At 2:05 p.m., Admiral Ito gave his final order. Abandon ship. It was over. Yamato had taken 11 torpedoes and at least 6 armor-piercing bombs, probably more. Her port side looked like a cheese grater, riddled with holes from bow to stern. Water was flooding in faster than the pumps could handle, which was academic anyway because most of the pumps had been destroyed. The list had reached 15 degrees and was accelerating. Once a ship lists past 20 degrees, capsize is inevitable. Nothing can stop it. Ito refused to leave the bridge. This was his ship, his command, his responsibility. Japanese naval tradition held that a captain goes down with his ship, and Ito wasn't going to be the man who abandoned that tradition, even as everything else was falling apart. He ordered his staff to evacuate, but many refused. If the admiral was staying, they would stay too. So they stood there together on the tilting bridge, watching the horizon rotate as the ship rolled over, waiting for the end. Below decks, the evacuation was chaos. Hatches that should have been easily opened were jammed by blast damage. Passageways were flooded. Men were trapped in compartments filling with water, beating on sealed doors, screaming for help that couldn't reach them. Some sailors made it to the deck only to find the list was so severe they couldn't climb up the tilted surface. They slid back down into the ocean as the ship rolled over beneath them. At 2:23 p.m. on April 7, 1945, the Yamato reached the point of no return. The list passed 20 degrees, then 25, then 30. Men on deck felt the world rotate around them. The horizon stood up vertical. What had been down was now sideways. What had been sideways was now up. Physics took over. Gravity became the enemy. Men slid across the deck, tumbling into each other, crashing into gun mounts and railings, falling into the sea. And then, deep in Yamato's guts, something catastrophic happened. Fire, which had been spreading through the ship for 2 hours, reached the main magazines. The forward magazine, to be specific, the one that held shells for the main 18.1-inch guns. Each shell weighed over 3,000 pounds and contained hundreds of pounds of high explosive. There were dozens of these shells stored in the magazine, maybe hundreds. They all detonated at once. The explosion was beyond anything the human mind can properly process. It registered on seismographs in Australia. It was felt by American ships over 30 miles away. The fireball was visible from Kyushu, 100 miles distant. The mushroom cloud climbed 6,000 meters into the air, higher than Mount Fuji, a pillar of black smoke and debris that marked the spot where 72,000 tons of steel had been transformed into expanding gas and shrapnel. American pilots flying overhead were nearly knocked from the sky by the shockwave. One pilot, trying to describe it later, said, "It was like watching the earth split open, like God himself reached down and said, 'Enough.'" 1 second there was a ship. The next second there was nothing but smoke and fire climbing into the heavens. We stopped attacking. There was nothing left to attack. We just circled and watched and tried to understand what we'd just witnessed. Another pilot said, "I saw the biggest man-made object I'd ever seen in my life vanish in a heartbeat. Just gone, like it had never existed. And I thought about all those men on board. Thousands of them, all gone in the same instant. Vaporized. I wanted to feel victorious. We'd just sunk the most powerful battleship in the world. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt sick. When the smoke began to clear, there was nothing left. No ship, no wreckage. Nothing floating on the surface. Yamato had been blown into pieces so small that most of them sank immediately. The largest piece of wreckage they found was a gun turret, torn completely off the ship and lying upside down on the ocean floor. Of the 332 men who sailed out on the Yamato, only 280 survived. Think about that. A 91% casualty rate. For every 10 men who left port, 9 of them died. Most of them died in that final explosion, vaporized instantly, which is probably the mercy. But some survived the explosion only to find themselves in the water, miles from land, surrounded by burning oil and debris, with American aircraft still circling overhead. Some drowned, some succumbed to injuries. Some lasted hours in the water before exhaustion took them. The destroyers picked up who they could, but there weren't many to save. The American losses? 10 aircraft. 10. And most of those were operational losses, planes that ran out of fuel trying to get back to the carriers or that crashed during landing. Probably fewer than 20 American personnel died in the entire engagement. 10 American dead versus 3,000 Japanese dead. That's not a battle. That's not even a one-sided victory. That's extermination. That's industrial-scale slaughter dressed up in the language of military operations. And the worst part? The absolutely soul-crushing part? It didn't change anything. Not one thing. Okinawa fell to the Americans anyway. The war continued. The atomic bombs fell. Japan surrendered. The Yamato sacrifice didn't save a single life. Didn't slow the American advance by a single day. Didn't change the outcome of a single battle. 3,000 men died for absolutely nothing, except to preserve the illusion that Japan was still capable of offensive operations. That's what makes this story so haunting. It's not just that the Yamato sank. Ships sink in war. That's what happens. It's that she was sent out to sink. She was sacrificed deliberately, knowingly, with full awareness that she'd never return, and for no strategic purpose whatsoever. Those 3,000 men might as well have been lined up and shot. The result would have been the same. Actually, shooting them would have been more merciful because at least it would have been quick. But let's take a step back for a second, because there's another layer to this story that's going to make you rethink everything you know about World War II. The Yamato wasn't just sunk by bombs and torpedoes. She was sunk by an idea. Or more accurately, she was sunk by the failure to abandon a bad idea when all the evidence said that idea was killing you. Think about it. By April 1945, Japan had lost 4 years' worth of evidence that battleships were obsolete. Pearl Harbor proved it on day 1. Midway confirmed it 6 months later when Japanese carriers were sunk before their battleships could even engage. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw Japanese battleships charge into battle only to be torn apart by aircraft before they could close with the American fleet. Every major naval engagement of the Pacific War proved the same thing over and over. Carriers beat battleships. Aircraft beat big guns. Mobility beats armor. And yet Japan kept clinging to the battleship doctrine, kept believing that one decisive battle, one glorious engagement between surface ships, would somehow turn the tide. It's like watching someone repeatedly touch a hot stove and insist that this time it won't burn them. This time will be different. This time the old ways will prove superior. Why? Why couldn't they adapt? Why couldn't they look at the evidence and say, okay, we were wrong, we need to change our strategy? And the answer gets to something really fundamental about how institutions think, or more accurately, how they fail to think. Once you've committed to a path, once you've invested resources and prestige and national identity into a particular approach, changing course becomes psychologically almost impossible. It's not just admitting you made a mistake. It's admitting that all the people who died following your plan died for nothing. It's admitting that all the resources you spent were wasted. It's admitting that you need to start over from scratch. And nobody wants to do that. Especially not proud military organizations with centuries of tradition. So they double down. They find reasons why the old approach is still valid. They blame external factors for their failures instead of questioning their fundamental assumptions. They convince themselves that one more try, one more throw of the dice, will vindicate everything they've done up to this point. The Americans didn't have this problem. You know why? Because American military culture, for all its faults, has always been pragmatic to its core. If something works, you do more of it. If something doesn't work, you stop doing it and try something else. There's no shame in changing tactics if the change keeps your people alive and kills more of the enemy. The goal isn't to fight honorably or to preserve tradition. The goal is to win, period, end of story, by whatever means are most effective. That's a cultural difference that goes way deeper than just military strategy. It reflects fundamentally different worldviews about what matters more: honor or effectiveness, tradition or innovation, dying gloriously or living pragmatically. And in war, pragmatism wins. Every single time. Because dead heroes don't win battles. Living soldiers do. So when we ask how the Yamato was destroyed in a single afternoon by American aircraft, the answer isn't really about torpedoes or bombs or tactical coordination, although those things mattered. The real answer is that Yamato was destroyed by Japanese High Command's refusal to accept reality. She was destroyed by the weight of tradition and honor and face-saving bullshit that made it impossible for Japan to admit they'd built the wrong kind of navy to fight the wrong kind of war, and 3,000 men paid for that failure with their lives. Now, I want to talk about those survivors for a minute, the 280 men who made it off Yamato alive, because their story doesn't end when the ship sinks. In some ways, their story is just beginning, and it's not a happy one. Imagine surviving that. Imagine watching your ship, your home, the place where you've spent years of your life, literally explode beneath your feet. Imagine being thrown into the ocean, surrounded by debris and fire and the bodies of your friends, floating there while American aircraft circle overhead like vultures, not sure if they're going to strafe you or let you be. Imagine spending hours in the water, getting picked up by a destroyer that's just as likely to be sunk as you were, knowing that the battle isn't over yet, that you might still die out here. And then imagine making it back to Japan. You're alive. You survived. You should be grateful, right? You should be celebrating your incredible luck. But you're not, because you're returning to a country that sent you out to die, and you didn't die. You failed at your mission, which was to sacrifice yourself for the emperor. You're coming home when you were supposed to be dead. The psychological term for this is survivor's guilt, but that doesn't even begin to cover what these men experienced. In Japanese culture in 1945, especially in the military, there was genuine shame associated with surviving when your comrades died. It meant you weren't brave enough. You weren't dedicated enough. You put your own life ahead of your duty. Some survivors of the Yamato were actually treated with suspicion and contempt when they returned. Some were questioned about how they survived, as if surviving was itself a crime that needed to be explained. One survivor spent the rest of his life, decades after the war, trying to explain to anyone who would listen that he didn't abandon his post. He stayed until ordered to leave. He tried to save people. He did everything he could, but the shame never left him. He felt like he'd failed his shipmates by living when they died. That's what a toxic culture of honor can do to people. It makes survival feel like cowardice. Another survivor refused to talk about the Yamato for 40 years. Not a word. Not to his family. Not to historians. Not to anyone. When he finally agreed to be interviewed, he was in his 70s. And the first thing he said was, "I still hear the explosions. I still see the faces of the men I couldn't save. I've carried them with me every day since April 7, 1945. And I'll carry them to my grave." That's the human cost of war that doesn't show up in casualty statistics. It's not just the 3,000 men who died. It's the 280 men who survived and spent the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. It's the families who lost fathers and sons and brothers. It's the children who grew up without dads. It's the wives who never remarried because they were waiting for husbands who were never coming home. It's the ripples spreading out from that one afternoon in April, touching thousands of lives across decades. And for what? What did any of it accomplish? Did Yamato's sacrifice inspire the Japanese people to fight harder? No. By April 1945, most Japanese civilians were starving and terrified and just wanted the war to end. Did it slow the American advance? No. The Americans took Okinawa on schedule. Did it destroy enough American ships or aircraft to make a difference? No. The Americans lost 10 planes and replaced them within days. All it did was prove that Japan was willing to throw away lives for symbolic gestures. All it did was demonstrate that Japanese military leadership had completely lost touch with reality. All it did was add 3,000 more names to the list of people who died in a war that Japan had already lost but refused to admit. And that brings us to the wreckage. Because the Yamato is still down there, 340 meters below the surface of the East China Sea, broken into multiple pieces, scattered across the sea floor. She's been down there for 80 years now, rusting slowly, collapsing gradually, becoming one with the mud and the silt and the deep. Divers have been down to see her. Deep-sea submersibles have photographed the wreckage, and what they describe is haunting in a way that's hard to put into words. It's not just a shipwreck. It's a graveyard, a tomb for 3,000 men whose bodies are still down there, trapped in sealed compartments or scattered across the ocean floor. The ship is their cemetery. The ocean is their headstone. One diver who went down to see the wreck said something that stuck with me. He said, "It's not a ship anymore. Ships are functional. They have a purpose. This is a monument to hubris and waste, and the futility of clinging to the past. Every twisted piece of steel, every collapsed bulkhead, every empty gun mount is a reminder that you can't fight the future with the weapons of the past. You can try. Japan tried. But the ocean doesn't care about your honor or your tradition or your warrior spirit. The ocean just takes what it's given." Another diver said, "When you're down there floating above the wreckage, you can almost feel the weight of all those lives. It's oppressive. It's suffocating. You want to leave, but you can't look away. Because this isn't just history. This is a warning. This is what happens when pride matters more than wisdom, when tradition matters more than adaptation, when you'd rather die gloriously than live pragmatically. The wreck is deteriorating, slowly but inevitably. Eventually, maybe in another century or two, it'll collapse completely. The steel will corrode away. The structure will become unrecognizable. And when that happens, the last physical evidence of the Yamato will disappear. All that will remain are photographs and documents and the memories of survivors. And eventually even those will fade as the last people who remembered die off. But the lesson should remain. The lesson has to remain, because the same mistakes that doomed the Yamato are still being made today, in different contexts, in different fields. Organizations clinging to outdated strategies because they've always done it that way. Institutions refusing to adapt because adaptation requires admitting past failures. Leaders doubling down on bad decisions because changing course would damage their pride. The Yamato is what happens when you let your ego write checks that reality can't cash. When you build your entire strategy around what you want to be true instead of what actually is true. When you sacrifice people to preserve an idea that stopped working years ago. Before we wrap this up, I want you to take a second and think about what part of this story hit you the hardest. Was it the scale of the destruction? That mushroom cloud climbing into the sky? Was it the futility of it all? 3,000 men dying for nothing? Was it the individual stories? That kid writing in his diary that he wasn't afraid even though he clearly was? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single comment on this channel because I want to know what resonates with you. What makes you think? What makes these historical events feel real and relevant? And listen, if you made it this far, if you stuck with us through this entire journey from the birth of the battleship doctrine to the final explosion, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. You're not here for surface-level facts and quick summaries. You're here to understand, to really dig into the why behind the what, to see history not as a collection of dates and battles, but as a collection of human decisions, human failures, human tragedies. So do me a favor. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell, because we're bringing you stories like this every single week. Military history that goes deeper than Wikipedia. Stories that make you think about how organizations succeed and fail, how cultures shape warfare, how individual decisions ripple out to affect thousands of lives. This is history that matters, history that's relevant, history that teaches us something about human nature that's still true today. Now, let's talk about what the Yamato's sinking meant for the broader war, because there's a final twist to this story that's going to bring everything full circle. When news of the Yamato's destruction reached Japan, there was an official attempt to spin it as a heroic sacrifice. State propaganda described the crew fighting valiantly to the last man, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy before finally succumbing to overwhelming force. They called it a glorious example of the Japanese warrior spirit. They used it to call for even greater sacrifice from the civilian population. But the Japanese people weren't buying it anymore. By April 1945, everyone in Japan knew the war was lost. The cities were being firebombed. The Americans were on Okinawa. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war. Food was scarce. Resources were exhausted. And now the mightiest battleship in the world, the symbol of Japanese naval power, had been destroyed in a single afternoon without accomplishing anything. The sinking of the Yamato didn't inspire resolve. It inspired despair. It made people realize that if even the Yamato could be swatted aside like an annoying fly, what hope did Japan have? It accelerated the psychological collapse that was already underway. Some historians argue that the Yamato's destruction contributed to the eventual decision to surrender, because it demonstrated beyond any doubt that continued resistance was pointless. On the American side, the reaction was more complicated than you might think. Sure, there was celebration. They'd just sunk the most powerful battleship in the world, with relatively minimal losses. That's a victory by any measure. Pilots who participated in the attack were decorated. The battle was used as proof that American naval aviation had achieved total air supremacy over the Pacific. But there was also a certain discomfort. Some American officers felt like the whole thing had been unsporting. Like clubbing a seal. The Yamato had been sent out to die, and the Americans had obliged, but there was no glory in it. It was more like an execution than a battle. One admiral was quoted as saying, "We destroyed a magnificent ship today. She never had a chance. Part of me wishes we could have captured her instead, preserved her, studied her. She represented the pinnacle of battleship design. Now she's gone forever, and all we have to show for it is a bunch of gun camera footage and 3,000 dead Japanese sailors." That's an interesting perspective, isn't it? Even in victory, even after completely dominating the engagement, there's a sense of loss. Because the Yamato represented something. She was a marvel of engineering. She was the last word in battleship technology. She was a piece of history being made in real time. And now she's at the bottom of the ocean. And we'll never see her equal again because nobody will ever build another battleship. The age had passed. The Yamato was the last gasp of a dying breed. There's a Japanese word, motai nai. That doesn't translate perfectly into English but roughly means what a waste or how regrettable. It's used when something valuable is wasted or destroyed unnecessarily. And I think that captures the feeling around Yamato's loss better than any English phrase. Motai nai. What a waste. All that steel, all that craftsmanship, all those lives, all that potential. Thrown away for nothing. The 8 destroyers that escorted Yamato didn't fare much better, by the way. 4 of them were sunk during the same attack. The cruiser Yahagi, which was part of the task force, went down with all hands. The other 4 destroyers limped back to Japan, damaged and demoralized. Of the roughly 4,000 men who sailed out on Operation Tengo, fewer than 400 made it back alive. That's a 90% casualty rate for the entire operation. 90%. For no gain whatsoever. In the decades after the war, the Yamato became a symbol in Japan, but not in the way the military leadership intended. She didn't become a symbol of courage or sacrifice or warrior spirit. She became a symbol of waste, a symbol of leadership failure, a symbol of what happens when you let pride and tradition override common sense and reality. There's a famous Japanese film from 2005 called Yamato, which tells the story of the battleship's final voyage. It's not a triumphant war movie. It's a tragedy. It focuses on the human cost, the wasted lives, the pointlessness of the sacrifice. The tagline of the movie translates to, "The men who sailed to their certain death." That's how modern Japan remembers the Yamato. Not as a glorious last stand, but as a cautionary tale about the cost of refusing to accept reality. And I think that's the right way to remember it. Because if we remember the Yamato as some glorious, heroic sacrifice, we miss the point entirely. We perpetuate the same toxic thinking that got those men killed in the first place. The idea that dying for a lost cause is somehow noble, that symbolic gestures matter more than actual results, that honor is more important than survival. No, the Yamato story is a tragedy. It's a warning. It's a lesson in what not to do. And the lesson is this. When the facts change, change your mind. When your strategy stops working, adopt a new strategy. When your weapons become obsolete, build new weapons. Don't cling to the past because it's comfortable or traditional, or because admitting you were wrong feels bad. Because if you do, you're going to end up like the Yamato. Obsolete, outmatched, destroyed, and worst of all, forgotten except as a cautionary tale. The aircraft carrier won. The battleship lost. Air power beat armor. Mobility beat strength. Adaptation beat tradition. Those are the facts. Those are the lessons. And if you're a leader, if you're someone making decisions that affect other people's lives, you need to internalize those lessons. You need to understand that what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. You need to be willing to change, to adapt, to admit when you're wrong and try something different. Because if you don't, you're going to send people to die for nothing. Just like the Japanese admirals who ordered the Yamato on her final voyage. They knew it was pointless. They knew their men would die. They sent them anyway because changing course, admitting defeat, accepting that the old ways had failed, all of that was too psychologically difficult. So they chose to sacrifice 3,000 lives rather than sacrifice their pride. That's not honor. That's cowardice. Real courage would have been standing up and saying, "This is wrong. This is wasteful. We're not doing this." Real honor would have been protecting those men's lives instead of throwing them away. Real strength would have been admitting weakness and changing course. But they didn't do that. And 3,000 men died. And 80 years later, we're still talking about what a pointless, tragic, avoidable waste it all was. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. The Yamato wasn't destroyed by American aircraft. She was destroyed by Japanese leadership's refusal to adapt. The bombs and torpedoes were just the mechanism. The cause was institutional rigidity, cultural pride, and the fatal inability to change when change was desperately needed. And that's a lesson that applies far beyond naval warfare. It applies to businesses that refuse to innovate and get disrupted by startups. It applies to governments that cling to failed policies rather than admit mistakes. It applies to individuals who keep doing the same thing expecting different results. The world changes. If you don't change with it, the world moves on without you. And if you're responsible for other people, your refusal to change doesn't just hurt you. It hurts everyone who depends on you. The Yamato should have been a museum piece. She should have been preserved as a testament to the pinnacle of battleship engineering. Instead, she's a pile of rust on the ocean floor, and 3,000 men are buried in her wreckage. That's the real tragedy. Not that she sank, but that she had to sink. Not that men died, but that they died for nothing. All right, we've been on this journey together for a while now, and if you're still here, I want to thank you. This isn't easy material. It's heavy. It's depressing in a lot of ways, but it's important. These stories need to be told. These lessons need to be learned. Because if we forget what happened to the Yamato, if we forget why it happened, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes in different forms. So let me ask you one final time. What's the most important lesson you're taking from this story? Is it about the danger of obsolete tactics? The importance of adaptation? The human cost of pride? The difference between honor and effectiveness? Whatever it is, drop it in the comments. Let's start a conversation. Let's think about how these lessons from 1945 apply to the challenges we're facing today. And if this video made you think, if it made you see World War II naval warfare in a completely different light, if it made you understand the human dimension behind these massive historical events, then please do 3 things for me. 1. Hit that like button so YouTube knows that long-form, in-depth historical content is what people want to see. 2. Share this video with someone who's interested in history or military strategy or just good storytelling. And 3. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. Because this is what we do here. We don't just recite facts. We don't just describe battles. We dig into the why. We explore the human dimension. We ask the uncomfortable questions about leadership and strategy and the cost of war. And we do it in a way that's engaging and suspenseful and makes you actually care about events that happened 80 years ago. The Yamato is gone. The men who sailed on her are gone. But their story remains. Their sacrifice, as pointless as it was, teaches us something valuable if we're willing to listen. And I hope you've been listening. I hope this story sticks with you. I hope the next time you're faced with a difficult decision, you remember the Yamato and ask yourself, am I clinging to an outdated approach because it's comfortable? Am I refusing to adapt because change is hard? Am I prioritizing my pride over the well-being of the people who depend on me? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then learn from Japan's mistake. Change course. Adapt. Evolve. Because the alternative is to end up like the Yamato. Broken, obsolete, forgotten except as a warning to others. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with this journey from start to finish. And I'll see you in the next one, where we'll dive into another incredible story from history that's going to make you think about warfare, leadership, and human nature in ways you never expected. Until then, take care, and remember, the past has lessons for us if we're brave enough to learn them.